Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our 2020 election series, Environmental Risks in Energy and Metals Life Cycle. Today, I am working with Michelle Foss, who is going to moderate this discussion, but she was just finishing up on our roundtable series on minerals, and she'll be joining us here hopefully in the next couple minutes. And so what she's going to be doing, I'll give you an overview of how we're going to manage today, but we will do quick introductions. I'll give you a short background about why this is of interest to me and how my research and my interests intersect with what Michelle is doing with the roundtable is involved in. Michelle will be giving a recap of the roundtable highlights and talk about our quarterly series, that we have, and then we'll lead into a discussion with comments on current state of the world with the energy transition. We'll talk about the need to accelerate and some of the consequences for supply chains. Including ESG pressures and end-of-life considerations, and that's largely what today is going to talk about. My background is largely in waste management and waste policies, and so I've been tracking and looking at what the world looks like as far as from the lens of hazardous waste management and solid waste management. And so as we migrate into this energy transition, I think it's really important for us to think about how we're going to be managing things that are entering the waste stream over the next 5, 10, 20 years. There's really not a great understanding of what those waste streams are and where they're going to be managed and how they're going to be managed. And so, we need to understand that to reduce risks and also to meet those global climate targets and sustainability goals. But we'll move into a bit of an armchair discussion. And that'll be fairly interactive. We have some slides that we put together and some research that's in its infancy, but you'll see what we're kind of looking at from the data that we could scrape up with waste and lithium batteries and things associated with that, and then we'll move into a Q&A session and wrap it up. But I see that Michelle has joined us, so I will turn the mic over to her for welcome introductions, and then we'll move forward.
Well, I think you've done welcome and introductions very ably. First of all, let me thank you, Rachel, for taking time out from the floor, so to speak, of the American Institute for Chemical Engineering's Global Symposium on Plastics, squeezing in this webinar into the busy schedule for all of that so that we can share some of what we're doing with people. Let me just say for the participants in this webinar, we just had a really great private roundtable with our colleagues, Bob Brackett and Tristan Abbey, and we'll be putting some public domain comments out from that. This was for our Energy Forum members at the Center for Energy Studies. The Energy Forum is really important to us in terms of supporting all of the work that we do. And some good things came out of that to lead into our discussion. The first big one, of course, is that everybody loves to talk about recycling. So Rachel, you've got an open floor on that one. The extraction side, not so much. And this is what we know. What we know is that there's a lot more interest in the idea of being able to recover materials, but as part of the end of life process, rather than opening up and expanding existing mining facilities either here or abroad in order to meet the tonnages that we're talking about. And the tonnages are substantial. And I think we covered very good ground on that and have covered good ground on that in past programs. Most of the estimates are anywhere from a doubling or more of tonnages that will be required to meet the ambitions that people have for electric vehicles, for battery energy storage to balance intermittent alternative energy sources and other things. These are compelling questions associated with this broad idea of energy transition that everyone is discussing and talking about. There are some pretty harsh realities in all of this that we need to get our arms around and understand better. Our focus for this session today is on end of life and the various environmental, social, governance, more the E part of the ESG formula as we think about from raw material to application, meaning consumer products, to the ultimate end-of-life management, whether we are going to be able to recapture materials, whether we are going to have to dispose of materials, and that basically sets up, I think, for Rachel, kind of the best entree to begin to talk about your views on these things in a very liberal way. The bigger picture world of electronic waste, e-waste in general, and specifically for the topic today, how we think about our modern lithium-based batteries and associated metals within that picture. So if you could tell a little, if you haven't already told the audience some of your background, please do so. And then let's plunge into your framework, your thinking that you're starting to do on how we consider these things, e-waste and the world of lithium batteries.
Sure. Yeah. So my views today are shaped predominantly by my varied background in the waste management sector, beginning with being a military and government contractor as a hazmat chemist and working around the world, classifying, packing, and preparing shipments for import and export. For final treatment and disposal. And so it took me around the world where I experienced waste being generated in different countries and industries, working with every single hazard class that's out, explosives, biohaz, radioactive, flammables, et cetera. And when I finally left government contracting and entered the private sector, I had the opportunity to work within a range of industries in oil and gas, petrochemical, pharma, aerospace, geothermal plants, and so forth. And so I managed waste and environmental and process safety programs on site. And then I eventually moved over into the commercial sector for the treatment, storage, and disposal facilities before taking my experience to DC to be a regulatory and technical policy director at American Chemistry Council. And then prior to joining here at the Baker Institute, I was a senior executive at the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, which is a federal agency that has jurisdiction over the classification, packing, labeling, and shipment of hazardous materials, including lithium-ion batteries and other things that are out there. And so what I learned in my 20 plus years is that it really didn't matter where in the world I was working. Waste was being generated, even in Antarctica, and much of the waste was characteristically the same. The economy was expanding, our waste volumes were increasing, and they were becoming so much more complex, which made them very, very difficult, if not impossible, to recycle and manage at the end of life. And our laws and regulations were not keeping pace with these materials and waste, and in some instances becoming much more divergent. Mm-hmm. And so I've had some interesting opportunities to understand these issues from a variety of lenses, and working on the ground and working within facilities and shaping policy. In DC, and then from a regulator's lens. So I understand and really appreciate these challenges that we're facing, especially as we start talking about sustainability and end of life management.
So why don't you tell us your views on e-waste in general, and then how these relate to the particular problem of lithium battery products?
Sure. Yeah. So I've been examining many different types of waste streams for many years, and the one that I find most interesting, especially as it relates to something that's critical for the energy transition and relevant for this discussion, is electronic waste or e-waste. And those are things. The definition is varied, but it essentially covers discarded electrical or electronic devices. And it's become the fastest growing waste stream in the 21st century. And because these e-waste contain highly valuable precious metals and other secondary resources, as well as hazardous toxic substances, the issue of their regulation, it lies at a liminal space between product and waste. And this ushers in a complex legal interface that engages, distinct and sometimes contradictory international regimes of trade and environmental protection. And so, what does this have to do with lithium-ion batteries? When I look at the e-waste industry and how the world has been trying to cope with managing this ever-evolving and growing waste stream, I'm reminded of the parallels that we are facing with lithium-ion batteries. So think about how these two waste streams are similar. We have rapid technology development, deployment, and obsolescence. We have very high consumption rates and short life cycles. We have a lack of developed or fragmented waste management technologies, and a lack of, and sometimes conflicting disposal and recycling policies, both domestically and internationally. Very complex transportation networks. These things exchanges multiple hands to reach the final disposal or recovery site. We have global supply chains. Those supply chains are oftentimes opaque. We have a lot of definitional disparities and classifications. We have a dearth of viable recycling options for these, and the end of life is very difficult to assess. We just have a lack of data, and processes on how to manage these at the end of life supply chains are very poorly understood within the life cycle assessment context. And so this has led to a fundamental disregard for end of life considerations. And then the last similarity that I oftentimes see is that we have known yet unquantified environmental and social justice impacts. And so specifically with lithium-ion batteries, when we look at the data that we have out there, less than 5% are being recycled of the lithium-ion batteries, and this data comes from.
That's Rachel. Just a quick interjection. A global number, right?
That is a global number, and that comes from the EU Commission, that comes from DOE, that comes from a lot of peer-reviewed journal articles. I haven't been able to validate that. That's one of the things that, the work we're doing, we'd like to get a better sense of that. It doesn't include lithium-ion batteries from EVs, as far as I can tell. But when we look at lithium battery waste, China's annual lithium-ion battery waste is on track to reach over 500,000 tons by the end of this year, and over 1 million tons by 2030, and over 10 million tons per year globally. And so that's a crazy number, considering we're not recycling most of this. And so the majority of these, from what we see from the data sets that we have, is that they're largely incinerated and landfilled. And recycling costs it's just cost prohibitive. It's labor and energy intensive, and there's a whole lot of technical constraints to this. And the R&D, we've been focusing a lot on lowering price and charge capacity and battery longevity, but we're not spending a whole lot of time looking at recyclability and reuse. And because the industry lacks a clear path to large scale economical recycling, the battery researchers and manufacturers have traditionally not really focused on improving recyclability. And so the reason why I find these two issues compelling is that lithium-ion batteries are contained in many of these types of e-waste, and they're oftentimes classified and defined interchangeably with e-waste. And so it makes it very, very difficult to track at the end of life when you're not really sure how to classify it, and what systems to look into. And we'll get more into that as we advance through some of these slides. So you almost have to look at these two issues concurrently.
All right. So speaking to slides, before you give everybody a data picture on what you were talking about on end-of-life management, let's show people the wonderful regulatory labyrinth. Can you control it, or you want me to? Let's see. Here we go. There you are.
Okay. All right. Yeah. And so, okay. So the concept of cradle to grave tracking and responsibility seems like a very simple and straightforward concept, right? But once you start wandering to the regulatory abyss, it quickly becomes evident just how obscure and Byzantine the waste and recycling network is, especially when it's expanded to global trade. And so what you see here, it really is just a spattering of different agencies and controlling statutes, regulations of supply chain activities, and different international standards across the battery supply chain, and it's hard to really assess. I mean, end of life for lithium-ion batteries and e-waste. I mean, like I said, there's virtually no data, and throughout the life cycle, you have so many different activities and so many different agencies and policies with that, and so one of the things we're trying to do is understand this. I'm kind of map this out on what are all the different activities across. So let me get back into sort of the framework for this. We're essentially mapping a project that tracks waste and recycling trade flows for batteries and e-waste domestically and internationally. And foundationally, we need to understand this regulatory mapping of this. And so we're going to be answering the question of whether or not policies that cover activities across the supply chain for materials handling and storage and safety, waste disposal, recycling, exporting, emergency response, and other things, are they adequate to even cover the current and future goals in production? And so all of these policies that you see in front, and this is not exhaustive by any means. They're the ones that immediately came to mind, is something that we need to understand. So we need to understand what these barriers are to achieving sustainability and circular economy, and the barriers to recycling. And the only way to really do that is to pick apart these different standards and regulations and understand them, and understand when they apply and when they don't apply.
Mm-hmm. As usual, when you've got this large number just for the United States of controlling statutes, agencies, all of the different supply chain components themselves, standards, and so on, the possibilities for either conflicting signals, lack of coordination, other things are pretty high, right? I mean, that's an observation from my own experience in the labyrinth. And I asked you a question the other day that I'm going to ask again, because it's a good one-word answer. If you just look at RCRA, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, that we're going to be talking more about in a minute here, if we wanted to improve how data and information across waste management related to RCRA facilities and RCRA rules was handled, if we just wanted to streamline that, how long would it take?
Well, I mean, first off, probably decades if you're going to start trying to make statutory changes to RCRA. But yeah, I mean, so it would take a long time. Rulemaking is a very lengthy process in general, but it's really not just changes to RCRA or some of the implementing regulations that EPA and other agencies have. It's just that there's so much intersection and crossover between them, and so if you change one thing, it may have effects and impacts in other. But I mean, there's a lot to be said about harmonized regulations and standards. There's many benefits to it, because it reduces trade barriers and provides certainty and consistency for the regulated community, and it makes compliance easier too. So that people don't have to contend with and comply with multiple requirements. But in the case of this, it's very difficult. It would take years to really understand all the different nuances and pinch points with RCRA and all the intersections with others. So it's a lengthy process, and rulemaking and standards development is never easy. I mean, a lot of the standards development and other things take place on the international arena, and they're negotiated, there, and then that's eventually brought down to the nation states, and to and domestic rulemaking, has to take place, and so then you have to follow the APA process and open it up for rulemaking and notice and comments, and that whole process. And oftentimes, what you're left with is really a departure in some ways to what was negotiated. So it's really complicated, in other words.
Great. Okay, now, so to give people a flavor of what we're trying to do, and to go to your points on data and data sources, as we plunge into this, we should recognize Elsie Hung, our research manager. As Elsie has done a yeoman job of trying to assemble data from, in this case, the Environmental Protection Agency records, And so we want to credit her for the work that she's been doing, that ultimately at some point, I think, Rachel, you'll build a dashboard or provide public access to some of this once you all figure out how you want to do it. So just walk us through some of these things as best you can.
Sure.
The patterns.
Sure thing. And so what you're looking at here is, this is data that was pulled from EPA's REPRA info database, and that's all information that is received by states and sent to EPA. And a lot of this comes from the hazardous waste manifests that are used to ship hazardous waste, domestically and outside of the U.S. And so this is just data for 1 year. From, what do we have, June 2018?
2019, roughly.
Oh, yeah. To May 2020. And so these are 8.8 million records of waste lines extracted from the manifest. And so the reason it only starts from June 2018 is that EPA had this rulemaking, and they have the electronic e-manifests, which is something new for the agency. And so all of the other manifests, the old form-filled manifests, were archived out of the system, and so this is what they have in there now. But so what? So I guess as a starter here, I'd love to offer you all an optimistic message on the issues surrounding this stuff. But as you can see, the complexities are very deep. But from the data that we have from the REPRA info database, as it stands right now, what we're seeing is that we have most of it going to either metals recovery, incineration, or something called storage, bulking, and or transfer offsite. And all of these are taken from, they're called management method codes. And that's something that the facility, TSDF, the Transfer Storage Disposal Facility, assigns when they receive the manifest, and it directs how that waste is going to be managed. And so that's what metals recovery is one code, incineration is another, and there's a multitude of different codes, as you can see to the code on the right.
And can you, very quickly, we've got 2 UN codes specified here, the United Nations 3480, 3481. Can you just explain a bit about what those codes are?
Yeah, those are codes, shipping codes that identify what hazardous material is going to be that is being transported. And so those 2 codes are specific to lithium-ion batteries. And so it doesn't include the, regular, primary lithium batteries. Is specific to lithium-ion batteries.
Okay. All right. While I'm switching slides, let me remind the audience, you can pose questions. You can start to submit those. We'll see them in the Q&A box. So feel free to go ahead and send those in to us. So here we are now looking over time, Rachel.
Yeah, and so with this picture, we see that 50% of the lithium-ion batteries that we pulled from the database were incinerated with the management method code of H40. And one thing that's there's been a lot of variation through the months. We're not really sure, what those patterns mean just yet. But there's a lot to be said, I guess, with what this means and how it was actually finally treated at the end of life. Because, just because something, was incinerated, what we don't really know is that, for example, was the entire lithium-ion battery incinerated, or was it dismantled or whatever, and they extracted some metals and then some portion of it incinerated. So there's still a lot of there's still a lot of analysis that we have to do in really understanding what this means.
I asked you the other day, we had a discussion about the storage and transfer bottom parts of these bars and what's happening in those, and we actually really don't know, right? We can't assume that the same proportions of incineration versus recycling will happen out of that, correct?
Well, okay, so let me explain the H141. So essentially what that is that it means that the site receiving the waste, they either store, they bulk, or they transfer the waste. Without any treatment or recovery. There's no field blending or disposal, at that site. So generators, and I'll just give a little background on that process as I remember it when I was working, in the field, is that generators in most part of the country, they oftentimes don't direct manifest to final treatment facilities. And this can be for a number of factors. It could be, because it's complicated logistics to really set up dedicated shipments and get qualified transporters. Oftentimes the facilities are not in close proximity, so there's higher costs for direct management. And you need a separate and direct waste profile that's approved by the receiving facility. And then oftentimes most waste vendors, they're a one-stop shop, and so what they'll do is they'll come to your site and they'll take your materials and then they'll bring it back to their holding facility or transfer station, and then they'll ship it back up. But if you generated enough waste to send a dedicated trailer for final treatment to an incinerator, for example, it would make sense. So the handling codes are assigned, as I mentioned, by the TSDF. And let me just give you an example. Maybe it would help you understand what this means and where the confusion lies. So if a facility receives, say, 100 drums of a solvent waste from 10 different generators, and they mix all of those 100 drums into a bulk tank that's destined to be burned as fuel, like at a cement kiln. There's commingling of waste happening from various generators, and so this is a form of treatment. And so they assign it a different handling code, which is I can't remember what that is, H61. And then that waste is shipped to the kiln to be burned as fuel, and then a new outbound manifest is generated by that first facility. With that facility being listed as the generator. And so that's important to know, because just because something is well, let me back up a little bit and give the converse means for that. So the original TSDF on the generator manifest doesn't do anything except store the waste for more than 10 days. So if they just receive these drums, they manifest it out to a second facility with that H141 code. And so that original generator maintains that cradle to grave liability until the waste is processed at the final disposal facility. But the generator only receives a copy of that manifest from the original TSDF, where they manage their waste on the manifest. And so that's where it kind of gets lost. So looking at the data more closely since our conversation, some of this does include material that was eventually shipped off for treatment, and so and we can get into that in some of the other slides where we look more at the facilities themselves. But again, this, I guess, goes back to your comment, Michelle, is that it's not really clear. But you lose sight of how things are actually treated and where they went to, and you have to do kind of a deeper dive, is which what we need to do is get data from states, get data from directly from generators and TSDF to really track it, because it's hard. You don't really have that linkage to track it back to where it's going to go. So with the storage, it's really sort of an unknown until you really get down to the data and see, okay, once it was received at this facility where you think it's going to be incinerated, it likely is being remanifested out to another facility for alternate treatment in some other way, whether they're going to recover some of it or landfill others. So it's really I don't want to say it's a black box, but it's
close to it.
Yeah.
All right, let's continue on. I've got an audience question that I'm going to hold for the end. So here we are now at the designated facilities. Ta-da! There's not very many of them.
Yes. Yeah. Right. And so yeah, we learned that by looking at some of the data, and I really don't know. It could be a multitude of different reasons. for this, RECRA, as you stated, and we have seen now working through this, it's pretty complicated, and it, being the principal federal law in the U.S. governing disposal of solid and hazardous waste, it's really infamous for that, and it's known for that. And obtaining, a RECRA Part B permits and other types of permits to run and manage a facility is pretty complicated. It's high barrier to entry. It comes with a lot of liability, especially since we know that lithium-ion batteries are highly reactive and prone to catch fire. And new facility siting is it comes with a lot of complications. You can't site in 100-year floodplain. You can't site within 200 feet of an active earthquake fault for obvious reasons. There's a lot of environmental justice considerations, preventive actions that you have to consider, post-closure requirements, and a lot of other information that's required in the process, from waste analysis information to descriptions of security procedures, inspection schedules, geologic location, training plan, emergency response plan, and financial responsibility documents, and a very comprehensive groundwater monitoring data. So there's that, and then the other thing might be that only certain facilities have the permits and capability and technology to manage and incinerate reactive waste, and so that also could be another factor, and then just the proximity. Actually, if you advance, I don't know where it is in the slide deck, but if you advance the slide where it actually shows the facilities, I think let's see, did we lose Michelle? We might have lost Michelle in here. So let me try advancing, see if I can advance the slide. Okay, all right, here's that slide. And so my thought on this, and if you all can see it, from it here, you see that most of the batteries that are pulled from this database is going to Heritage Environmental for incineration, but then you also see a large portion in purple that's going to Retrieve Technologies, and Retrieve Technologies is a metal reclamation recycling facility, and that company has been recycling lithium batteries for over 25 years. They started off actually processing lithium primary batteries, which are the non-chargeable batteries, and so a lot of that could be due to pure proximity of that. And so anyway, so what this slide is, on the left here, I'll explain that. On the left is what you see, you'll see some density hotspots on there, and those are all exporting domestically. And again, this is just a domestic picture. So you see, exports from coming in from Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Alaska, and others, and those are color coded with the management method code. So you see a whole lot of, as Michelle was referring to, the question she had on the handling and storage, a lot of it, being stored for a period of time and then being sent to other facilities, and then those facilities, receive it and send it out to other disposal facilities. Let me see if I can. Let's see what other slides we have loaded up here. And we included this slide in here. One of the things that I'm working on doing is looking at world trade flows of waste. And welcome back, Michelle. Sorry about that. It's all right. It's all right. I've moved on. I've moved on without you.
Yes. No. Perfect.
So this last slide we have here, we debated whether or not to put it in there. I mean, this is all from the UN Comtrade database, and something separate that's even more confusing when you start integrating the UN work. But this is world trade flows of waste and spent batteries and electric accumulators, and this is just in 2018. And when we included this to show that, it's not just the domestic management and shipments of waste batteries, that is complicated. When you pair that and overlay that with the international picture and the global picture, and you start looking at how it's classified under the Basel Convention, how it's classified in the EU, it becomes even more difficult to understand what you're really managing. I mean, the Basel Convention, for example, there's no distinction between lithium metal batteries and lithium ion batteries, and they're still trying to work to classify even the lithium ion batteries and e-waste for that matter. And so you can't really make that distinction when you start looking at the data from the Basel Convention, which, the United States is not party to the Basel Convention. And the Basel Convention is the international convention that controls the transboundary movement of hazardous waste and their disposal. And even though we're not party to the convention, we still trade with countries that are party to the convention. And so a lot of what happens with Basel has direct impacts and indirect impacts on how we manage our waste, with our trading partners. So it's and so much of this, goes to classification, and classification here in the United States. Classification between states is complicated too, and can be different. For an example, like waste that may be hazardous, that California might think and deem as hazardous waste, may not necessarily be classified as hazardous waste, and could be considered non-hazardous waste in another state. And so you have to take those considerations into play. But I mean, so classification. The bottom line to all of this stuff is classification. And for me, and my opinion with some of this is that classification generally determines the end of life management of that. I mean, not always, but primarily when I'm looking at things. And from my various viewpoints, I think it does. I mean, is a battery classified as an e-waste? Do you manage it do you classify it for waste or recycling? Is it a product for reuse? Is it a commodity? And there's all kinds of loopholes in between. With the Basel Convention, as I mentioned, there's a lack of definition for recycling, reclamation, recovery, remanufacturing, repurposing, and reuse. And so that's been a major barrier to developing a common understanding and subsequently a business case for these processes. And so some of these diverging and outdated definitions and classifications for recycling and post first life processes can result in ineffective implementation of policies. And that's where you get into this utter confusion, especially as we talk about now lithium ion batteries from electric vehicles, and we start talking about the energy transition technologies. And solar panels. Solar panels also are in many times classified as e-waste. And so we have this broad category that ropes in so many different categories and so many different products. And so it makes it really hard to track and sort out these things when they're broadly categorized, like that. And so that's what we're faced with. And the other thing I'll mention, Michelle, is universal waste, right? We've talked about universal waste in our conversations, and universal waste is essentially a category of hazardous waste. They have relaxed regulations, and so you don't have to comply with all of the requirements for full hazardous waste management. But the problem with from a tracking standpoint with universal waste is that you don't have to track it and use a federal hazardous waste manifest, and there's this exception for that makes it even more confusing too, because you have an exception for a shipper in a state that has an additional state listed universal waste, because again, EPA has a broad federal rule for universal waste, but they allow the states to adapt it to their needs. So some states, some categories like e-waste is considered a universal waste. Others, it's really not. And so you have to take that into consideration. But there's no hazardous waste manifest. And if there's no hazardous waste manifest, it's not going to be entered into that database that we can pull that data from. And then there's also no reporting to state or federal EPA. So a lot of the small quantity generators and the large quantity generators have very limited reporting obligations to that. If you're a large quantity generator for universal waste, you just have to maintain records, on your site that you sent it to another facility. So all of these lithium ion batteries and e-waste that are being categorized as universal waste, it makes it impossible really to track these things because they're not in any of the databases. And so that's why we're going to that's why we're looking at states and working directly or trying to work directly with with generators and treatment storage disposal facilities to see if we can cobble together a nice looking picture of that.
All right, we have a bunch of questions related to what can be recycled and what can't be recycled, and we need to kind of be brief on those. And some I can probably help with, but of course, one of the main questions is why aren't we recycling more? What is recovered when we look at battery metals? If a lithium-ion battery is incinerated, what happens to the lithium? What are some of the considerations in terms of recycling metals? Are they of the same quality as initial raw materials? Let me just say quickly on this that we've been in touch with and have been interacting with and had them in Houston with us last year. Some of the researchers at Argonne National Labs, which has the portfolio for battery recycling among the Department of Energy labs, National lab system, they're very optimistic, but it's modeled. What they think can be recovered from batteries theoretically is fairly high. After a discussion with Rachel and our team the other day, I actually went to one of the metals recycling websites, and lithium is not recovered at that particular facility. Right. And whereas other metals can be, and of course we know this is one of the dilemmas. We know that something like copper is relatively less difficult, let's say, to recover as scrap. But recovering lithium, cobalt, other metals and minerals that are integrated into the battery structure, the cathodes, anodes, electrodes, and so on, is a whole different ballgame. So that's one thing. And what I would say on why we aren't recycling more. We had an interesting discussion about that, the economics of recycling, and the extent to which you have to have enough material that is in the market to make recycling work. You have to have a cost structure for recycling that's favorable, right? You mentioned a little while ago how difficult it is if you're going to operate a facility as a RCRA facility. The front end costs, barriers to entry, and other things associated with that. So any other comments to make along that cluster of questions? Other than what I said?
It's really hard to really know how much is recycled and recovered, because even when and just looking from a paperwork and chain of custody perspective, you're not given back something that says, oh, we recycled and recovered this much of your waste. It's just, yes, we received it. Here's your certificate of disposal and a certificate of recycling. It really doesn't tell you much. So when we say, oh, batteries, your waste stream of batteries has been recycled, well, how much of it and what was recycled? You just don't know. And in the work that I've done in my previous life, tracking some of these things as a waste generator, you quickly see that your waste streams can be parsed into a variety of different places. And so a lot of the lithium ion batteries are not recycled. I mean, so we've known that, but oftentimes with the lithium, if it's not recycled, It is remanifested out to another treatment, storage, disposal facility where they will, they'll stabilize it and landfill it, in a RECRA regulated facility. And even if things are sent to an incinerator, those ashes will get stabilized and sent to a landfill. But and some of the, and this is all anecdotally, but some of the conversations that that we've had over the years, and now more recently, is that the lithium ion batteries are not recovered, and if it is, it's recovered with impurities. And so, what does that mean from not only a safety perspective, if you're going to put that into a second use in another application, but what does it mean for performance too? And so at present, there really is no facility in the United States that fully recycles a lithium ion battery. And what I mean by that is rendering a used battery into its constituent materials and selling or reintroducing all of that resultant material back into commodity markets. Although there are several U.S.-based companies that accept and treat batteries to some degree, but there's no facility that I'm aware of that fully recycles a lithium ion batteries. We only have a few key companies in North America market with the established technology and capacity to process lithium ion batteries from electric vehicles, and Umicore is a significant player right in Europe in terms of capacity, and that's the only company with European operations that accepts deliveries of EV batteries for recycling from North America. But yeah, I mean, so with the recycling, it's something that you don't really know, because the tracking for things, and the separation and the commingling of materials on how they're managed at the end of life is difficult to track. And so we don't really have a clear picture on exact quantities of things. But we do know that batteries and other materials that are sent to recyclers aren't oftentimes, even recycled. And a lot of that has to do with the market and the economics, and with the rapid development too of technology and our regulations and our downstream activities. So the end of life technologies and the end of life regulatory frameworks are not keeping pace with what's happening upstream. I mean, and again, I'm going to compare this to the evolution of e-waste. I mean, just look at CRTs, the cathode ray tubes, the big monitors. Those those have lead, and then we migrated over to a flat screen, the LCDs, but they had mercury, and so now we're trying to figure out, okay, how do we manage all of these with mercury? So you're shifting risk, right? And then we moved to LEDs. And although they were mercury free, they contained, lead and silver, heavy metals, and other materials. And now we're moving on to, quantum dots, nanoparticles that have cadmium nanoparticles, another heavy metal, toxic heavy metal, and not even a full understanding, even close to a full understanding of nanotoxicity. And so we really have to be aware of those types of things when we think about end of life, and we wonder, well, why are things not being recycled? A lot of that, there's just so little coordination and collaboration across that entire supply chain. And we need to find a way to sort of concatenate these, the upstream and energy industry and supply chains with the end of life supply chains, and that's something that's a struggle.
Let me just add, one of the questions that came up is whether we're not defining a massive ESG problem and talking about all of this. I asked Rachel the other day whether we need to take a pause in the energy transition conversations, in which everybody is very ambitious and wants to accelerate and move things forward very quickly, and step back and try to figure out the end of life stuff first, if that's not going to be a popular idea, of course. But otherwise, we're constantly bootstrapping, as you described, for looking across the electronics world at the way we've handled things.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And let me comment on that. I mean, so I think we're making notable advancements in low carbon technologies and other innovations, and we shouldn't stop doing that and finding ways to align with the vision of a sustainable future and a circular future. However, that being said, I do think there needs to be greater coordination to help bridge the glaring knowledge and data and technology gaps, so we can start making informed and data-driven decisions, along with those regulations that don't hinder managing waste in the most cost-effective, environmentally sound, and socially compatible manner. At the same time, the EPA's that landmark universal waste rule that went into effect for the entire all 50 states it was supposed to increase and promote recycling due to streamlined regulations. But if we don't have the scalable technology and the capacity, the material is not going to be recycled anyway. So we do need policies to keep pace with activities and technologies.
Right. Related to that, one of the follow-on questions was, for instance, if we look at Europe, do we see awareness of this growing internationally? We've been talking about comparisons in Europe, what other countries are doing that are managing all of this, whether we can look at some different examples of how people are trying to aggregate waste, do a better job of categorizing it, taking different approaches on tracking systems. Do we know enough to be able to make a comment on any of that?
I think the EU is, they have a battery directive. They are working on, trying to understand, e-waste. There's a lot of work being done on the international front on Basel Convention and other venues for that. But the question is, like, how do you, how do you sort of merge that with, because it's going to come down to the nation states to be able to create the regulations to implement those things. But there is activity internationally for sure on sustainability, ESG factors. I mean, because people really do care, and so I think from a classification and definitional standpoint, there seems to be more uptake for that in Europe and elsewhere than there is here. Which is interesting because we are such a connected, globally complex economy, and we do need in some ways to be on the same page when it comes to that, if we want a better understanding of what's really happening to our materials.
Here's an interesting one. Actually, one before it that I'll just comment on to the question of what happened. Are there other ways of looking at what's getting recycled by looking at procurement? And the answer would be yes. Of course, that's going to be a lot of work to actually go out there and identify customers for recycled materials to see what they're actually buying and how much they're buying and with what quality concerns and other things. That's the only way to get that information, maybe through some of the trade groups, which we're continuing to explore. A sort of a more fundamental question is whether battery chemistries and designs could be altered to better accommodate recycling. I think to some extent, battery designers, battery scientists are taking some of those things into consideration. However, and Rachel, I think you even made this point the other day, everyone is focused so much on performance.
Yeah.
You have to get over those hurdles. Just what is going to come into the market that can support the kinds of things that people want, which are, say, mobility that works like mobility we're familiar with now with petroleum fuels. How do you get equal and affordable mobility with a battery electric vehicle? I think everyone is really focused on that, and kind of, gee, what do we do with it when we're done using it is sort of coming later, don't you think? I mean, that's my general impression as we've looked at the the state of knowledge and the state of R&D.
Yeah, it is. It's an afterthought. It's definitely an afterthought. And you know, it's not surprising to me, you know, as spending so many years in waste management and seeing all these volumes grow and working on you know, waste minimization, you know, strategies. But yeah, I mean, it's a complex field. But we do have to start thinking about end of life in all of this. I mean, we haven't even talked about we haven't talked about like renewable technologies and what the forecast for those are, and the data needed to really understand once we start decommissioning these things, you know, wind turbine blades and solar panels and other things. What in the world are we going to do with them? I mean, the projections are really dire, and if, you know, it runs counter to what the industry is held up to be. And so if we truly want this circular economy, and if we embrace sustainability goals and align with climate targets, I mean, we have to start looking at things and approaching our business models different. And so the real question to me, I mean, how big of an issue will climate be, you know, in November's presidential election, right? I mean, if you look at some of the polls, it's interesting because climate change doesn't even make the top 10 concerns among registered voters. Even as the U.S. faces extreme weather from wildfires, and you know, scientists are being more you know, talking more about these issues. I mean, climate change ranks 11th behind the economy and healthcare and Supreme Court appointments in the pandemic. And so, you know, so when I talk about, you know, people migrating over to circular economies and reduce, reuse, recycle, and re-engineering, you know, I wonder, are we ready for that? Because when you look at our consumption cycles and
Oops, it looks like Rachel's had a disruption like I had a little while ago. I agree with her on all of those points. What I'll say is that as we've been talking with people who are thinking about this, I want to acknowledge how generous and forthcoming people in the auto industry have been as we have reached out to them to try to understand their views on how used batteries will be handled from electric vehicles, their own custodial responsibilities, how they think the market will develop, and so on. They've been very frank about all of this and very honest in talking about the need for third-party offtake, third-party recycling, and other things that will be viable in order to deal with this the right way. The other point that I would make to the one that Rachel was making about the importance of all of this related to the election, of course, there are any number of discussions about how to accelerate an energy transition in the United States, at what cost, with what federal support, and so on. And I would have to say that only now, 12 or 18 months into very visible discussions on all of this, only now are people starting to talk about the end-of-life management on these things. There are some initiatives that we talked about in the private roundtable earlier. Some of the proposed bills in Congress do include some aspects of that, mostly on the recycling side, but very little really. And it ought to be an upfront topic, especially if you're talking about using taxpayer resources to help accelerate development. I want to thank everybody for attending. If you've been part of the webinar and you've seen what we've been showing you in this slide deck, and you have comments or feedback for us on how we are starting to look at this and the data that we're collecting and the myriad issues, please let us know. You can find us on the Baker Institute website. We're going to be working on this quite a while, and then we will be making these results public as soon as we're able to clarify a few things on data sources and what we're actually seeing in the information. So this is an ongoing work. We also are all going to be contributing to our Baker Institute post-election policy briefs. So we are all going to be putting what you heard today in some form or another into those briefs for the next administration, the next Congress to be thinking about, as well as across the states, state houses, municipal governments that are trying to take initiative on these things. It's the only way to go forward, of course, is to try to raise it up the flagpole and get people to think about what it is they need to think about. And with that, I will thank you for spending the afternoon with us. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope this it helped to uncover at least a little part of the picture of what we are talking about with regard to our energy future and the kinds of things that we need to be paying attention to and responsible for. Best to everyone. Stay safe. Look forward to seeing you at our next webinar event.